Firstly, if you can please refer to the chat, there is a link on the chat that enables you to complete your attendance register detail. This being a CPD accredited session, through the details that you complete on the attendance register, that will enable us to circulate and distribute the certificate. So if you can please complete those as accurately as possible. Should you capture your details on the chat, we may miss populating your contact details. So if you can please refer to that. Secondly, whilst this is intended to be an interactive session, please request that all colleagues keep their mics muted. Should at any point that you wish to make a question or raise comment, please raise your hand. A member of the Intellectus team will recognize you and then allow you to proceed. Alternatively, you're welcome to write your comment or question or query in the chat at an opportune time that the team from Intellectus will be able to read out your question and comment. The session is being recorded. Secondly, we did have a technical challenge this evening. Ordinarily, we do a live session as well, also on YouTube. The recorded session will be made available tomorrow morning on YouTube. This evening's session is titled Mental and Addictive Disorders. Our keynote speaker and facilitator is Dr. Jacqueline Stone. A brief background about our lecturer this evening. Dr. Jacqueline Stone serves as a medical director and clinical lead at Advocate Health. She's a Zimbabwean primary care physician who grew up in Zimbabwe. She graduated from the University of Cape Town cum laude in 1989. She went on to get a Medical Research Council scholarship to do an honors degree in medical biochemistry, which she completed in 1992. From there, she went to the UK and worked in the Infection and Immunity Department of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London and wrote her MRCP in 1996. She then moved to the Middle East and worked in the airline industry for a period of 12 years. In 2003, she was part of the airline's SARS-1 task force. She completed a diploma in aviation medicine in 2008 from King's College in London. With this, she feels taught her a great deal about risk-benefit assessment, hypoxia, infectious disease treatment, and prevention and vaccination. In 2008, she moved to Australia and completed a FRACGP in 2012. She also became an inaugural member of the Australasian College of Aerospace Medicine in 2012. Both in the Middle East and Australia, she developed an interest in integrative medicine. She then returned to Zimbabwe in 2015 for personal reasons and is now an executive committee, is now serving on the executive committee of the Zimbabwean COVID Frontline Clinicians Society, who advocate for saving lives through early, safe, effective, affordable combination therapy. Dr. Jackie Stone is also an advocate of skills development and skills transfer. We extend a warm welcome to Dr. Jackie Stone. Dr. Jackie, good evening.
Thank you for that, Obi. Thank you for the introduction. This is the second in a series of talks on substance use disorder. And as part of our theme for this year, we're also bringing in an integrative approach to what conventional medicine has offered in the past. So if we look at mental health disorders, increasingly across the world with the American opioid crisis. There are more and more deaths of despair. Now, the disability adjusted life year is a measure of overall disease burden, which is expressed as the number of years lost due to ill health, disability, or early death. Now, mental and addictive disorders have affected more than 1 billion people in 2016, and we know it's at least 25% up. 7% of all global burden of disease, as measured in disability-adjusted life years, is due to mental health and addictive disorders. And depression was associated with most of these. Now, the frightening statistic is that currently, depression is the 4th leading cause of the global burden of disease. By 2020, it was predicted that it would be ranked 2nd. By 2030, depression will account for the highest level of disability attributable to any physical or mental disorder worldwide. So we really need to be acting proactively against this. I'm going to use a case history here. This is a patient that I saw some time ago. And I always find that it's easier to be able to learn things if you link it to a patient. So this was a 51-year-old male, regarded in society as successful. He'd been drinking, he was self-employed. He'd been drinking 2 to 8 units a night for stress and sleep for years, probably decades. When he was younger, he drank excessively socially. He would have been classified as a binge drinker. And when I saw him, he was still binge drinking once a week or so, but he did it on his own. He was fairly recently divorced. He was depressed. He'd been put on an SSRI, which hadn't worked. He'd really stopped socially interacting. He'd stopped fishing and golfing and doing the other things he used to do months ago. And basically never really went outside. The only thing he did was work, went home and drank in front of his TV. Anhedonia means literally the loss of joy or the loss of emotion. And he was complaining of that. For the last week to 10 days, he developed irritable bowel type symptoms. He'd had diarrhea. It had started after a binge, and the symptoms had not resolved for over a week. He was feeling miserable. He tried to stop drinking. After 1 to 2 days, he got severe craving, anxiety, insomnia, sweating, shaking, nausea. If he drank alcohol, the withdrawal reaction stopped. He tried again to stop with the same symptoms, but this time they were worse. And he's come in now for help. He describes his life as death by duvet. The anhedonia, the severe fatigue, inability to get out of bed, very low mood, no motivation, brain fog. All he wanted to do was lie in bed all day and do absolutely nothing. So he was diagnosed as having alcohol use disorder, which we will define later, with fairly severe depression. He was not suicidal, because that question had to be asked. He was advised to be admitted to hospital for a detox, and then advised after that to go for a couple of months into rehab in South Africa, where the rehab facilities, we don't really have any long-term rehab facilities in Zim, and certainly the ones that are there are full. The cost was $6,000 US, but the main issue was that he wouldn't be able to run his business. So he said that financially this was not a feasible option. So what now? Do we refer him to psychiatry? We know what happens when we do refer these patients to psychiatry. they kind of go onto a benzo and SSRI. If that fails, then antipsychotics are added, or amitriptyline, or other psychiatric drugs, which often don't necessarily make the problem any better. So let's look at the conventional route. If we were to manage his depression first, we would want to do bloods, which would include a standard full blood count, UNE, LFTs, check his vitamin D level, homocysteine, B12, hormones, including testosterone. We would image his liver, consider starting an SSRI, consider treating with a short course of diazepam while he comes off alcohol to reduce the severity of detoxification and withdrawal symptoms. He should be given thiamine and a multi-B. He should be in a place of safety. Home nursing 24/7 is an option. Being with a good friend is an option. But basically, we need to get him out of his current state to help him. And if anybody has any comments, please feel free to interrupt or ask any questions along the way. But what else can you do if this is a patient of yours who's a long-term patient who you're trying to help? Well, a lot of things that are overlooked in the conventional model are nutrition, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, how to reduce cortisol, restoring the microbiome, reducing neuroinflammation, improving mitochondrial function, and psychological rehabilitation. Now, you are certainly not expected to do this in one consult, but over a series of consultations, you could potentially cover a lot of this. So I just wanted to cover some of what is out there and where there's clear evidence that some of these integrative methods work, and to give you a bit of an idea of what else you can do for this patient. Because I'm quite sure everybody on this call has encountered either this patient or the spouse or sibling or parent of this patient, and nobody knows what to do. So I want to go into the power of nutrients, and I want to go back to 1977, which is, I think I would have been 12 in 1977. And at this stage, a study was done which showed how important nutrition was in people who had problems with addiction. Now, obviously, the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of recreational drug use, and a lot of people ended up in rehabilitation. And Alfred Libby and Irwin Stone were actually nurses, and they realized that addiction is both a disease and poor nutrition. Once people who are addicted to a substance have lost their appetite, they are deficient in vitamin C, other vitamins, other minerals, protein, and certainly while genetics and a bad lifestyle may have contributed to the disease, conventional medical therapy is almost useless until nutrition is restored. And I've put a link in there for you to have a look at that article. So their protocol was get off all drugs, which was usually heroin or methadone. And they used very high doses of vitamin C, sodium ascorbate, and they had the patient drink it during the day. And they also added multivitamins, mineral tablets, vitamin E, and a protein powder. And in 30 out of 30 patients, they managed to actually improve or reverse the problem with addiction. Apparently, one incoherent patient received 30 grams of vitamin C. 45 minutes later, he could hold a normal conversation. After 12 to 24 hours, his appetite started to return. Mental alertness and visual acuity were improved, and the patients were amazed that the treatment worked without any other narcotic. What Libby and Stone did is they demonstrated, and this Stone is no relation to me, by the way, but they basically temporarily cured 30 out of 30 drug addicts Obviously, it only lasted 30 days, so there was not enough time to evaluate the basic causes of the addictions. But this also illustrates, I think, the fact that our current model of when the heart-sink, hopeless, alcoholic or addicted patient lands in front of our desk, we only think to refer to psychiatry or to get them into rehab or to get them detoxed. And we put them into a hospital bed where they're getting no vitamin D and they're not necessarily getting any nutrition. So nutrition needs to be part of the initial regime if we are to help these patients. Thiamine deficiency is often forgotten. About 80% of people with an addiction to alcohol develop thiamine deficiency due to poor absorption. Now, if you look at the symptoms of thiamine deficiency, patients have loss of appetite, they have constipation, fatigue, blurred vision, heart rate changes, irritability. Most of these symptoms actually mimic alcohol withdrawal syndrome. So if you are about to tell a patient to acutely, completely cease alcohol after years and years of heavy drinking, you may have a patient who has a seizure, but if they're thiamine deficient, they're certainly going to have even more symptoms of anxiety, agitation, tremor, nausea, tachycardia, poor sleep, and they're much more likely to return to whatever substance they're addicted to earlier if you haven't corrected the thiamine deficiency. So what can we do? Let's take our current patient. His diet has basically been takeaways, largely chips fried in seed oil. And so he's effectively malnourished. He's had zero sunlight for at least 3 months because he's either in front of his computer or in his car or at work. He's not exercising at all. His stress levels are high and his health is poor, as demonstrated by irritable bowel-like symptoms. So if we look from a nutrient point of view at what reduces the craving to relieve these symptoms with alcohol, vitamin C, vitamin D, selenium, herbal remedies. Do we get the microbiome right? Exercise, sunlight, support. Actually, it's all of the above. So, getting back to vitamin D, which is one of my favorite subjects, the more I learn about this hormone, because it's actually not a vitamin, the more interesting it becomes, because bone health is probably the least of what it does. Immunity is huge, but it's very, very important in mental health. And it's been shown that vitamin D deficiency strongly exaggerates craving for the effects of opioids. And if you heavily supplement vitamin D, you can combat addiction, and the reference is there. Now, getting back to our patient who is complaining of death by duvet, I wonder how many of us look at these pictures and see teenagers of 2023 and young people of 2023 who actually are probably addicted to their computers and gaming. And unlike pre-screens, when children and young people lived outside and played football and rode their bicycles, a lot of kids these days, and young people and people who are older, engage in death by duvet. And many with addiction problems will not have had any sunlight for months. And probably the worst thing you can do is put them in a hospital bed in a dark room. If we look at the biochemistry behind how vitamin D is related to addiction, if from the last talk, for those of you that were on the last talk where we centered on dopamine as the reward system. The vitamin D receptor is very involved in both the production and the metabolism of dopamine. So from a mechanism of action point of view, we would expect increasing vitamin D levels to improve production of dopamine and then also its removal. Now, as I'm sure you'll remember, if somebody becomes addicted to anything, whether it is computer games or alcohol or cocaine or any of the harder drugs, and as we know in Zimbabwe, we've got a methamphetamine issue at the moment. For all of those, if there's a dopamine surge, there's a dopamine crash, and a dopamine crash will drive the same behavior, even if it's against the patient's frontal lobe action, because there's also damage to the brain with many of these substances. So in the study that they did with high-dose vitamin D, and they were giving 25,000 international units once a week. Now, certainly in the last 3 years, after liaising sort of globally, a lot of doctors were giving up to 300,000 units as a single dose. So this actually isn't a particularly high dose compared to what we've been giving in the last couple of years. But if we look at the cases that they report, they have a 49-year-old single male with a serious cocaine use disorder. He's got a low vitamin D, and 1 month after starting supplementation with vitamin D, along with naltrexone against a craving, plus vitamin B complex and thiamine, he gets his vitamin D up to 108 nanomoles per liter. Now, bear in mind, our laboratories will tell you that above 20 is normal. Above 20 means you don't have osteoporotic levels of vitamin D. The ideal vitamin D should be over 70. But the patient felt considerably better. Depression had disappeared without any antidepressant drugs. Now, while these are anecdotal stories, as Professor Barodi says, you need one Martian to prove there's life on Mars. And if we're not going to do any harm, there's certainly no harm in fixing the nutrition of some of these patients. The second patient is described as a 40-year-old woman who was a chain smoker, had underlying ADD, ADHD problems. She was using 10 milligrams of methylphenidate, also known as Ritalin, up to 4 times a day. She was on 20 milligrams of citalopram. She was using nicotine patches, and she was vitamin D deficient. Vitamin D was replaced. Once her vitamin D3 was at 17 nanomoles per liter, she managed to reduce most of the substances that she was taking. So I think first thing to do is to make sure that in your patient you do a vitamin D level, and if vitamin D is low, you treat the vitamin D deficiency. And you also need to educate the patient that they need an hour outside in the sun every day. And they need to get their vitamin D level above 70. Now, what is of interest, if you go into vitamin D deficiency, obsessive compulsive disorder, attention deficit disorder, schizophrenia, autism, depression, and anxiety are all associated with several mental health disorders. And it's also been shown that replacing the vitamin D will actually improve these disorders. We're not saying the vitamin D will cure it, but you're certainly not doing the patient any favors by not replacing their vitamin D. If you want the conventional therapy to work better, get the brain to be able to function better because it's got enough of what it needs to do so. Getting back to vitamin C, in a study of humans with heroin addiction, the experimental group were given oral vitamin C at a very high dose, plus vitamin E. The control group received benzodiazepines, specifically diazepam. 57% of the patients in the vitamin C and E group, and bear in mind that neither of those substances are addictive in their own right, because you have to be very careful of giving a patient who's already got an addiction a benzodiazepine. So 57% of the patients in the vitamin C and E group experienced significant reductions in withdrawal, whereas only 7% of the control group could say the same. Now, the other thing that will tend to make your patient relapse is if they're getting surges in cortisol with palpitations, sweating, tremors, and the other symptoms of withdrawal that go with very high cortisols. So I want to move over now into more of an integrative area. And as you know, Everlife are the nutraceutical arm of Evercare. And they have a company called Everlife in India with some very smart Ayurvedic doctors who are also pharmacists. So one of the things that I was introduced to when I was working in the Middle East was something called ashwagandha. And what interested me, that everybody over 40 in the Middle East seemed to be taking ashwagandha. Now, ashwagandha has about 12 documented modes of action, but one of its biggest modes of action is to reduce cortisol. And there are plenty of studies that will show that people who are on ashwagandha between 300 milligrams a day up to 2 grams to 3 grams a day is associated with reductions in cortisol compared with placebo. So ashwagandha's stress relieving effects may occur because it works on the HPA. And I think it's something you must take into consideration with a patient like this. How do you reduce the symptoms? A beta blocker may reduce palpitations. Ashwagandha may lower cortisol. It's considered an adaptogenic herb, and adaptogens in integrative medicine are defined as natural substances which help the body adapt to stress and exert a normalizing effect on body processes. In Africa, I would imagine that CBD would be used for a similar reason, except that CBD doesn't have the THC, or the THC component of CBD is not present in ashwagandha. But in Ayurvedic medicine, ashwagandha has been used for more than 2,500 years for its neuroprotective and antidepressant and anti-inflammatory properties. Something that Everlife do is they have made something called KSM-66, which is a high-potency, full-spectrum ingredient derived from the root of the ashwagandha plant, and it is designed for stress relief, energy, cognition, and immunity. And it has the highest percentage of the root extracts in the world. So one of the things we could offer this patient would be ashwagandha. One of the effects of ashwagandha, because it reduces cortisol, what happens is that testosterone and DHEA will naturally go up. And the reason for that is that cholesterol is made into something called pregnenolone, which is involved in word recall. And if all of the pregnenolone is going to cortisol, you will not make DHEA, testosterone, estrogen, or progesterone. So this drug is also known for its effects on fertility, because once you drop the when you drop the cortisol, then the other reproductive hormones have the chance to increase. Interestingly, it has been studied in alcohol withdrawal. And what was noted is that in mice that were expected to have seizures in ethanol withdrawal, none had convulsions, and it had the anti-anxiety activity similar to that of diazepam. The important thing about ashwagandha is that it's not addictive. So you don't end up exchanging one addiction for another. It's a safe and reliable alternative to diazepam in alcohol withdrawal conditions. Other herbs that balance the hypothalamic pituitary axis include holy basil, jatamansi, chamomile, and bacopa, and they can be found in various nutraceuticals around the world. Holy basil is well known as an adaptogen. In other words, it brings down cortisol, and it's known as the supreme anti-stress solution. Bacopa relieves anxiety, depression, and it has effects on cognition. It's quite useful in Alzheimer's and in neurodegenerative disease. If we look at studies on ashwagandha and bacopa together, we can see that they have a similar GABA agonist activity compared to benzodiazepines. And so they would protect against convulsions in alcohol withdrawal syndrome. Most doctors will give diazepam in a patient that wants to come off alcohol to prevent seizures and to minimize the side effects. There's no reason that you can't do both. If you were to give calm, ashwagandha, bacopa, and say, if that's not working, take 5 to 10 milligrams of diazepam, there would be no reason not to follow that approach. The benefit is if they don't need to take the benzodiazepines, the problems with benzodiazepines is they have a huge release of GABA, and then the patient has a GABA crash, which causes anxiety and will often get them to return to the substance. Now, let's get back to depression. What causes depression at a cellular level? And more, we are looking at neuroinflammation, neurotransmitter imbalance, and mitochondrial dysfunction. When I trained, everybody spoke about the synapse, serotonin, SSRIs, and neurotransmitter imbalance being the only things behind depression. But a lot of new theories are coming out, and some people actually believe that inflammation of the nervous system is actually much more important than we believed before. We certainly saw in the long COVID patients fluvoxamine reducing brain inflammation and improving patients with long COVID. Mitochondrial dysfunction, I will deal with in another lecture. It's a whole lecture on its own. There are probably about 10 different compounds that are largely natural, some are pharmaceutical, that will improve mitochondrial function. But if I go into that now, we'll definitely run over time. So let's look at neuroinflammation and mitochondrial damage. So people who are chronic drinkers and binge drinkers will actually create a lot of inflammatory cytokines in the brain. And that will activate the microglia. Now, the microglia was something that I'd completely forgotten about since medical school, but they've come back into fashion with a lot of the long COVID stuff, because the microglia are the immune cells. They're about 10% of the brain, but they are the part of the brain that activate when something's wrong. So the microglia get activated, And that can cause all sorts of problems, which can actually lead to Alzheimer's disease. Now, at the same time, the pro-inflammatory cytokines also cause mitochondrial dysfunction. So as you know, mitochondria generate ATP. Our brains consume 25 to 40% of the ATP of the body, of the oxygen of the body, because our brains are generally active and they require a lot of oxygen and a lot of fuel to run. And when you start interfering with the mitochondria, instead of making ATP, the oxygen is made into what they call a reactive oxygen species. And that causes cell damage. And between the inflammatory reaction and the reactive oxygen species with oxidative phosphorylation, you will start to get neurodegeneration in the brain. And I think this is something that is really worth showing patients that consume large amounts of alcohol and think that they are completely recovering, because in the long term, they actually, because the frontal lobe is involved, they lack the ability to assess their own performance and see that their performance is deteriorating. So getting back to the microglia, as I mentioned, they're about 10% of all brain cells. They're pretty inconspicuous, but they wake up when there's a threat. So they're continually surveying the brain environment. But when they sense a threat, they become active and they initiate inflammation, which is the body's reaction against invasion. So under normal physiological conditions, TNF-alpha is low, cytokines are low, glutamate is low, and the brain ticks along and everything's nice and normal. Stress conditions, this doesn't just mean psychological stress. This includes everything from encephalitis to toxins to physiological stress. But once you've activated your microglia, they start to produce a number of cytokines, the easiest of which to measure is TNF-alpha. And you start getting inflammation. And when inflammation happens in the brain, you start making glutamate. Glutamate is excitotoxic. It causes irritability. It causes a lot of excess. It's almost like the system will start to fit. There's too much excitation in the system. And when there's too much glutamate, you will start to get neuronal loss through apoptosis. Now, most people will go glutamate. Where have I heard that before? Monosodium glutamate in food, okay? So aromat, any form of chips, crisps, lots of fast food, it's full of glutamate. And one of the reasons it's addictive is that it does create a sense of energy, but it's actually causing neural destruction at the same time. Now, getting back to the fact that chronic stress doesn't mean psychological stress. What happens when the system is stressed, you produce more cortisol, your sympathetic nervous system is activated, your blood-brain barrier becomes more permeable, you make more inflammatory cytokines, and you start getting inflammatory cells going into the brain. The microglia are activated, and then through a series of steps, you end up with too much glutamate. Too much glutamate is neurotoxic, and that starts to affect your neural circuits. And if this is happening over time, repetitively, you will start to get problems with emotion regulation, reward processing, cognitive control, and ultimately you will end up with psychiatric issues. So there've been a number of studies. The review that I've put into this presentation here discusses how both peripheral and central inflammation affects brain function and structure in depression. And in this study, they measured inflammatory markers, plus they did functional and structural MRI scanning to look at neural circuit dysfunction in depression. And what they basically showed was that when you have chronic stress on the system, which would include alcohol, substances, chronic infection, anything that is non-physiological, you make more pro-inflammatory cytokines and you shift from making serotonin to making glutamate. And glutamate equals anxiety in general. It also causes apoptosis or death of the neuron, and you will start losing neurons. Now, in the last talk, we spoke about N-acetylcysteine. N-acetylcysteine is simply an amino acid which is made into glutathione. The glutathione doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. N-acetylcysteine does. And there are a multitude of studies that show that N-acetylcysteine may reverse the neural dysfunction seen in substance use disorders. Certainly, patients have been able to be weaned off bipolar medications and maintained on 2 grams of N-acetylcysteine a day. It dramatically reduces inflammation in the brain. It's an over-the-counter antioxidant, and it is thought to upregulate the glutamate transporters. So it gets glutamate out of the neuron. And particularly in the limbic system, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, this becomes very important. Sorry, it's duplicate. So we need to reduce brain inflammation. Now, there are some neuroscientists that believe that depression is actually a physical illness. They feel that either social threats or adversity or poor diet trigger the production of these pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha, and that orchestrates the host's response to injury and infection. And we all know that when someone is unwell, particularly we'll talk about someone feeling sick and feeling miserable. And that is partly because there's an inflammatory process happening in the brain, which can initiate profound behavioral changes, including the induction of depression. The next area I'd like to cover is the gut-brain axis, the vagus nerve and the microbiome. It's another area that we can look at in these patients who are struggling with mental illness. We know that over 70% of the serotonin that our body makes is actually made in the gut by our microbiome. In addition, whether we have a leaky gut or not determines what is actually allowed into the circulation and goes to the brain, which includes short-chain fatty acids, it includes neuropeptides, neurotransmitters, a multitude of chemicals, including serotonin, go from the gut to the brain. In return, the brain also communicates through the vagus nerve with the gut. And from the control of peristalsis, fight or flight response, all the way through to that gut feeling that something's really not right, we have the brain communicating through the vagus nerve with the gut. So let's start looking at diet. Now, our patient has been living on takeaway chips and burgers and probably Kentucky Fried for the last, if he's lucky, for the last 3 to 6 months. Diet is among the most evidence-based approaches to limiting brain inflammation. And a high carbohydrate, high calorie meal is related to high CRP, high interleukin-6, high TNF-alpha, all the markers of inflammation. And the one thing that is going to trigger inflammatory markers is processed carbohydrates fried in seed oils. These are generally the cheapest of foods, they're the easiest, and they're the most convenient of foods. And if you're driving home from work and you're hungry and you stop in to put in some fuel and you go in to the shop, you will almost certainly not find the kind of foods that are anti-inflammatory. You will find your biscuits, your crisps, the kind of food that will basically trigger inflammation in the brain. Now, if we consider the change from the 1960s and 70s through to today, in terms of what people eat and what's available to eat and the amount of exercise they do, it may not seem quite as far-fetched that in 2030, the biggest cause of disability in the world will be depression, if part of the reason for depression is diet. This is what we should be eating, but these are expensive. They don't tolerate Zesa power cuts without going off. They are, it means you have to cook things yourself, you have to wash things up yourself, and so people tend not, unless they are pushed into a corner, to eat for a healthy microbiome. So a healthy microbiome requires both that you put the right fertilizer into the gut, which are these kind of foods, but it also requires that you avoid the poisonous stuff, which is the carbs fried in seed oil. Now, if we look at the microbiome, we have 100 times as much DNA in our microbiome than we do in our cells. And some people have actually said we're actually just a host for gut bacteria. Now, the interesting thing about the microbiome is its reaction to alcohol. And where it's been studied in heavy drinkers, you will see that certain bacteria become abundant and others die off. Lactobacillus dies off, bifidus dies off. Something called actinobacteria is very prevalent in people who drink heavily. Now, in the same study using rats, they did fecal transplants, and they actually demonstrated that if you took intestinal microbiota from alcohol-intoxicated rats and put it into rats that hadn't been drinking, the rats that were the recipients would voluntarily consume alcohol. And the reverse was true. If you took stool from rats that had not been exposed to alcohol and put it into alcoholic rats, they stopped drinking. And this has been described anecdotally by Sabine Hassan, who came out to the Vic Falls conference. And one of the things she discussed was that while she was trying to treat C. diff patients with fecal transplants, she saw all sorts of unusual things where there were big changes in neurological activity, including Alzheimer's, autism, and alcoholism, when the fecal transplant was completed. But manipulation of the intestinal microbiota may alter the voluntary or involuntary consumption of alcohol. So, as has often been said, start with the gut. The microbiota plays critical roles in human health, and dysbiosis of the gut is correlated to various diseases of the central nervous system. Bifidobacterium and lactobacillus are the most critical ones. And I think the thing to mention here is that the term probiotics, they don't mention which probiotics they're using. They don't mention how many colony forming units there are. It's a bit like doing a study on antibiotics and not differentiating between amoxicillin and ceftriaxone. So the research on this is really still in its infancy. The term psychobiotics are being used, and they're a special class of probiotics which deliver mental health benefits. And again, specific strains of bifidus and lactobacillus are associated with improved mood. The psychobiotics are being studied at the moment in mental health, in neurodegenerative disorders, including Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and in neurodevelopment disorders, including autism and ADHD. One of the mechanisms of action of probiotics is going to be reduction of cortisol. That has been demonstrated. But far more than that, this whole gut-brain axis needs to be explored a lot further. And there are some studies that suggest that probiotics may be essential for people with depression, but it needs to be the right probiotics. So looking at psychobiotics, if you're going to choose a probiotic for your patient, look for something that has Lactobacillus plantarum in it. There are multiple studies that show behavioral changes in animals and reduced inflammation and corticosteroid levels. Lactobacillus rhamnosus is also known as an anti-allergy, but it also decreases anxiety and depression. And these are studies where these probiotics are used on their own. Bifidobacterium has become very publicized by Sabine Hassan because we know that in certain patients with long COVID, the bifidobacteria disappears. And the more bifidobacterium you have, the better your mental health, the better your immunity, and actually the longer you live a healthy life. Babies have about 90% bifido. By the time you're about 80, you've down to about 5%. So bifidobacterium, have a look at your probiotics. There will be a talk on probiotics given by Nikita from Avalife. So I'm not going to take this too much further. She's going to go into this in a lot of detail. And multiple strain probiotics can be, if you choose the right probiotics, which is a combination of lactobacillus and bifidus, you will be able to see that there's a lot of literature out showing that everything from autistic spectrum disorder to depression respond to good probiotics. So while we do say start with the gut, don't forget the gut. So our plan for our patient now extends more to rehab and Valium. Over time, we need to get him to change his diet. We need to get him to exercise. When we go into the mitochondria, we will show the effect of exercise on the mitochondria, but it has multiple effects, including the HPA axis. Exercise also improves the microbiome. We need to be making sure his vitamin D and vitamin C levels are adequate. We can reduce the cortisol response with ashwagandha as well as a number of other herbs, which include CBD, it includes holy basil. There's a multitude of ways of reducing cortisol. Reducing glutamate is seen to be increasingly important, and we need to reduce brain inflammation, which is probiotics, curcumin, and a number of other integrative methods. Treat the gut and use NAC. Now, please, I don't have a timer on this computer. How much time do I have left?
Colleagues, if you could please request that you mute yourselves. Thank you. Dr. Jackie, the time is 19:26. So we have 4 minutes left to
Okay.
7.
Okay, so I'm coming to the end of it. So one of the things we need to make our patients aware of is the cognitive defects. A 15-year-old male non-drinker and a 15-year-old male heavy drinker have very big differences in cognition. We, again, as I've said before, we need to be educating at teenage level. We also need to realize that just like in alcohol, there are changes in brain structure and mitochondrial defects happen when in Alzheimer's disease, and alcohol predisposes towards this. The basis of Alzheimer's disease is neuroinflammation and mitochondrial function. If you are going to get your patient to engage, they must get their psychology right. And this is more for future reference. For people who want to refer patients to online stuff, I would recommend Jordan Peterson. He says that if the most important things that lead to poor outcomes is the patient failing to take responsibility for his own life, people with insufficient order in their life, people with no purpose, no goals, no good friends, no intimate relationships, other health problems, drugs and alcohol. Now, one of the things we have to see addiction as is a social problem. For a lot of our youth who are using a lot of these substances, part of the problem is that they don't have purpose or goals. And positive emotion is a consequence of seeing things are working as you proceed towards a goal that you value. So the advice to patients is don't sacrifice your stability. It will keep your job. Be careful of your friends and put down the foundational pillars to rest the rest of your life on. And people need to also understand that they need to have a purpose. And life having meaning is not the same as life being pleasurable or happy. So that's Jordan Peterson's links. And I'd like to leave it here with saying you are not your problems. You are fundamentally that which, if it confronts its problems, can solve them. So thank you for that. And back to you, Obi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackie. Colleagues, at this juncture, we would like to invite any questions or comments.
Hello.
Hi, Petrus. You're welcome to carry on.
Good evening. I'm so happy to join this discussion. It is very, very important to us as nurses who are working in the primary health situation. So it is very helpful to us to understand the condition in mental health. I appreciate it to attending this session. Thank you.
Thanks, Petrus. I think, you know, for nurses who are confronted with a lot of these patients, when I was working in Australia, we had a lot of methamphetamine addicts coming into casualty, and they would get to the nurses first. And to be faced with a psychotic, young, strong patient is very difficult. And then once you have sorted them out, to face them every Saturday night for the next however many weeks is a problem, and we really do need solutions, especially for a lot of our young people, to educate them about the dangers of some of what they're doing.
Thank you, Dr. Jackie. There is a comment. In fact, there's a question here from, I hope I pronounce it properly, Alibina. The question is germophobia linked with mental health?
Look, I think, did you say germophobia? Are you talking about people who are terrified of getting an infection?
It reads as germophobia.
Okay.
Alibina,
So I think the last 3 years, we've been fed an enormous amount of fear through screens. You know, I joke that I first saw a TV screen when I was 12 years old, and then I think the only thing I was allowed to watch was Dallas. But life has been so infiltrated by screens, and so much fear has been put out about pandemics and germs, and a lot of people who have a propensity towards mental health disorders are going to become very scared by what everybody else says and what the screens say. So I think germophobia, any phobia, a phobia is an irrational fear. So if I, for example, am terrified of spiders, that's an irrational fear, because the chances of me killing the spider are far greater than the spider killing me. However, I think that it's difficult, without actually assessing the patient, to say that the germophobia is a mental health condition, when, especially for a lot of children, they've known nothing than to be told to wear masks, stay 6 feet away from each other, otherwise granny's going to die. So over the last 3 years, I wouldn't label somebody with a mental health condition if they are scared of germs. I think that the environment that we've been in for the last 3 years is conducive for people to develop phobias about that sort of thing. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Dr. Jackie. Alibina, I hope it makes sense. We have a question. I'm not sure whether you would have capacity to respond, but White Piri says, great insights. Thank you, Doc. How is witchcraft and mental health linked in our settings? Will we ever get our communities to acknowledge mental health?
No, I'm probably the wrong person to answer that fully, just from a cultural basis. But I think that if I was to answer it from a spirituality basis, I think that something that Western medicine has been guilty of, or not Western medicine, conventional allopathic medicine has been guilty of, is of not taking the spiritual side of life into account. Now, you can explain something through quantum physics, or you can explain it through witchcraft. But there's no question, I think, that there's a fourth dimension that many of us cannot explain. And it is quite remarkable how, if somebody believes something absolutely, it's the basis of the placebo effect. If I give you a pill and say, this will work, and it works, that's not witchcraft. That's the power of your mind. And we know that the mind is powerful enough to alter the immune system and various systems in our body. Now, I'm not sure of of the context of whether mental health is accepted in various cultures. I think in all cultures, people feel that people who are mentally unwell have been possessed or there's been some sort of interference with them at a spiritual level. But I do think that a lot of people actually would benefit from spiritual healing. I think that the world, by disallowing people to talk about the spiritual side of life, has removed a potential source of healing. So I'm not really equipped to answer that from my cultural standing, but my culture also has a problem with accepting mental health diagnoses. I don't think that people should be able to use mental health as an excuse. But at the same time, we really, really do need people to understand that there is often a physical basis to mental health. And that it can be, the brain is an organ. It needs to be treated with nutrition, with nutrients, with getting the gut right, with all the stuff that I've mentioned, and including allopathic medicines and including antidepressants. So that was a rather convoluted answer, but I think the basis of it is I think we need to acknowledge the power of the mind in terms of belief and spirituality. And I think that we need to make less of a stigma out of people with mental health conditions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackie, for that feedback and to all of the responses. At this stage, I don't see any more comments or questions on the chat. Colleagues, I also don't see any hands being raised. Okay. Yeah, Dr. Jackie, I think at this juncture is an opportune time for me to extend gratitude to you. There is one more comment encouraging that if we could have more sessions about mental disorder. So certainly, with your continued support, Dr. Jackie, we will definitely host more sessions in relation to mental disorder. Colleagues, if I can take this opportunity to please extend gratitude to Dr. Jacqueline Stone. She, having delivered this lecture quite succinctly, extended appreciation, Dr. Jackie, to you for having led us this evening. Secondly, colleagues, if you allow me to recognize all of yourselves, we wouldn't have a successful session without your participation and your being in these sessions. So extended gratitude for making the time to be in these sessions. Lastly, I wouldn't do justice to the session without acknowledging and recognizing our responses, that work to support Intellectus Campus to lead these sessions in Avacare Health. Avacare Health being a integrative healthcare and pharmaceutical entity that operates in sub-Saharan Africa with subsidiaries in all of our territories across SADC, together with AvaLife, whom Dr. Jackie had mentioned in the presentation, that there is certainly a presentation in probiotics that will be led by a team from Everlife out of India. So please look out for a session that we will circulate in respect to that. Lastly, if I can please request, there are 3 links that I have added into the chat. In the last link, or the latter link, if you can refer to page 22 in respect to a program called MOA, Medical Office Administrator, through the sponsorship of Evercare Health, together with some sponsorship from Everlife, they have extended an invitation to enable us to allow sponsorship of that particular program to a limited number of individuals. So you are welcome to be in touch with myself directly or Intellectus Campus by emailing info@intellectuscampus.com, or myself on obakeng.m@intellectuscampus.com. Put in that email address in the chat. So please feel free to engage, and we could extend some of that sponsorship, or the limited number of sponsorship, to some of your support staff. Colleagues, lastly, if you can please, in closing the session, please refer to the link with the attendance register. In order for us to be able to circulate the CPD certificates, you will need to complete your details on that link. If we don't have your details per that link, please note we may not be able to circulate the CPD certificate or CME certificate. So if you can please complete your details per the link that is on the chat. Colleagues, thank you very much once again. A very good evening. We will close the session at 2000 hours, 8 p.m. CAT. This to enable colleagues to complete the details on the attendance register. A very good evening, and see you next week for another session. Thank you. Please feel free to exit once you've completed your attendance details.
Thank you so much, Obi. Please stop recording.